We have our last talk of the first day of our symposium. I would like to introduce Clevis Headley with his talk called On the Very Idea of a Social Enantiomorphism. So Clevis, welcome, and the floor is yours.
All right, thank you. So it's good to be back here after 4 years. Do I get an extra 5 minutes ahead of time?
10 minutes, and then when you...
Five, yeah, it's zero, yeah. All right. The general focus of this essay is a relation among sameness, identity, difference. And its specific task is to utilize the chemical concepts of chirality and enantiomorphism as theoretical/metaphysical lenses to rethink sameness, identity, and difference within a socio-political context. Currently in North America, progressive thinking is fervently committed to radical ontological inclusivity, that is, to a structural equivalence that considers any form of social or political delimitation as either a case or an act of injustice. More specifically, liberalism, that is political liberalism, negotiate the challenge of thinking about sameness, identity, and difference evidence by utilizing a rigid identity logic predicated upon radical oppositions or binaries. Thus, in thinking about identity and difference, liberalism requires a commitment to the existence of stable essences. Substance A determinately differs from substance B because A and B possess different essences, so they are excluded opposites and are not relationally determined. On the other hand, if A and B are identical, they share the same essence or are considered replicas of each other. Hence, they do not possess any ontological significant differences. So on this identity logic, A and B cannot be both same and different simultaneously. An alternative approach to sameness, identity, and difference otherness is an ontology that would not permanently force a rigid choice between either sameness, identity, or difference, non-identity. And here I will argue that the concepts of chirality offers an alternative approach that I will refer to as the chirality of being. To chemical metaphors and the political discourse of liberalism. The intimate relation between liberal political thinking and chemistry is seldom, if ever, recognized. Liberal individualism can be considered the political equivalent of chemical atomism, since the liberal individualism presupposes social atomism. Elizabeth Wolgass has insightfully commented on the foundational or structural social atomism that underpins liberalism, a view that was shared by Thomas Hobbes and John Locke, two principal founders of social and political liberalism. Wolgass underscores the presence of chemical images, metaphors, and concepts in order to articulate the modern liberal conception of society. As Wolgass explains, quote, in Hobbes' picture of equal autonomous agents, people can be likened to molecules of gas bouncing around inside a container. Each molecule proceeds independently. It's free to go in its own way, although it occasionally bumps into others in its path. As molecules have their energy, people are driven by their passions, and their relations with one another reflect both their love of liberty and love of dominion over others. No atom helps or moves aside for another. That wouldn't make sense. They are a collection of unrelated units. This fundamental picture, she writes, I call social atomism, for it shows society as a simple collection of independent, self-motivated units, end quote. But social atomism is not simply a useful chemical metaphor for representing the structure of society. Social atomism ultimately mutates into a literal and scientific description of the political sphere. Here, the metaphor transforms into the ontological replica of the structure governing natural phenomena. As Wolgass further explains, quote, in form, social atomism appears scientific, and its analogs in science are easy to recognize. For we understand what physical compounds are when we know what they are made of. A molecule of water is made up of separate atoms, and to understand what water is, you must know about those atoms. Often we talk about compounds in terms of their parts. Why not apply the same method to a society? Thus, we can understand society if we know what it is made of. The resulting theory of society can then claim a truth that is extracted from historical contexts and can claim the lasting and objective validity of chemistry, end quote. To quickly summarize this point, social atomism presupposes that a whole is a summation of its parts, units, or basic constituents. This preliminary assumption is further augmented by the claim that the whole is reducible to its parts and that the whole cannot possess properties that are not possessed by its parts. 3, why chirality? The paradigm of sameness and identity is such a permanent feature of our metaphysical mindset that it marginalizes anything not accommodating this paradigm. However, despite our metaphysical prejudice in favor of sameness and identity, chirality that permeates both observable and non-observable nature provides a different metaphysical perspective. Even the great Louis Pasteur understood the ubiquitous presence of chirality, although he used the nomenclature dissymmetry. He states that life as manifested to us is a function of the asymmetry, meaning chirality of the universe and of the consequences of this fact. Although chemists do not require chirality to be explained, a simple way to understand it is that chirality is a characteristic of two objects that have mirror image identity, but that cannot be superimposed on each other. In more general terms, chiral objects are objects that are identical in every respect, but are not superimposable. So chiral things are both same and different. Another way to grasp the specifics of chirality is to frame chirality as the property of handedness. An object is chiral because a possessive handedness, meaning that like our right and left hands, chiral objects share many similarities but cannot be superimposed. This controversial definition of chirality was given by Lord Kelvin in 1893. Skip a little bit here. So to quickly summarize, the term chiral relates to an object that is not superimposable on its mirror image, or that objects displayed handedness. Since the left hand is not superimposable on the right hand, regardless of how both hands are oriented in space, it is not possible to align the features of both hands in a one-to-one correspondence. Indeed, the relation of non-superimposability between the left hand and the right hand is nicely illustrated if one attempts to shake the right hand of a person using his left hand. Finally, another prominent feature of the left hand not being superimposable on the right hand is the impossibility of fitting a left-handed glove onto a right hand. Then chirality and chemistry. Now, one of the most intriguing contexts of chirality is chemistry. Unlike the non-chemical context, in chemistry, chirality applies to molecules. Let us quickly consider the case of here isomers. The term isomorphism was coined by the Swedish chemist Berzelius to refer to the phenomenon in which compositionally identical substances exhibit different properties. Berzelius' notions emerged from his working experience with cyanide acid and fulminic acid, whose chemical behavior differs significantly, although they were composed of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen in equal proportion. And we can say that they're isomers because they have the same molecular formula, but have a different arrangement of atoms in space. Now, molecules possessing the same molecular formula and the same bonding arrangement, but having a different arrangement of atoms in space, we call our stereoisomers. Put differently, stereoisomers are isomers that differ in the spatial arrangement of atoms, but that do not differ in the order of atomic connectivity. Stereoisomers that display chirality and that are not superimposable like an object and its mirror image are called enatomers. Hence, enantiomers denote or designate pairs of stereoisomers that are non-superimposable mirror images of one another. This is the case precisely because they have the same composition and similar structure, but differ in terms of how they rotate in the plane of polarized light. So enantiomers are not superimposable in the same way that mirror images and hands are not superimposable. There's no way to rotate them so as to make them identical in all respects. In other words, two identical molecules, one of which is right-handed and the other left-handed, are in fact different. In particular, they do not have the same cases biological properties. From this, it is clear that chemistry provides an intriguing manner of conceptualizing the ways in which sameness and difference can coexist. These chemical concepts highlight the way in which difference may be present in the midst of sameness without either sameness nor difference losing its ontological status. Thus, contrary to traditional metaphysical assumptions that relegate difference to a secondary ontological status and privilege the ontological primacy of sameness and identity, chemical practice establishes that difference coexists with and is as significant as sameness or identity. I argue here that it is possible to invoke this complex way of relating sameness and difference to resolve some similarly intractable problems within political philosophy. So 5, social chirality or political enantiomorphism. Again, the main goal of this essay is to offer an initial sketch of a new concept that I'm proposing, that is social enantiomorphism, as a conception of social difference, of social sameness and difference that is modeled on chemical enantiomorphism. The objective then is to exploit the ways in which traditional political and social notions that equate sameness with replication and superimposition can be more effectively reconfigured according to the insight that things that look the same are not necessarily superimposable, nor are they necessarily identical in all respects. For purpose of this essay, the strategy is to utilize the idea of non-superimposability of mirror images to discuss social and political notions that have been mistakenly assumed to be superimposable. I argue that just as in chemistry, social and political sameness and difference do not exist as radical opposites, but as ontologically co-equal. There is no need to reduce one to the other or to define one in rigid opposition to the other. This will be done by focusing on entities that share similarities in most regard, but that are not superimposable on each other. In this context, the differences being considered are not hegemonic phenomena, but are rather the products of historical processes. 6, chirality of historical processes. To illustrate a socially enantiomorphic difference, let us consider the difference between immigration to the United States from Europe and immigration to the United States from Africa. It is commonly accepted that American culture is by definition a majoritarian white Anglo-Saxon Protestant culture. As such, immigrants to the United States who were not part of this dominant culture experienced various stages of discrimination and marginalization. For example, immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe and immigrants who were not Protestants were not regarded as white, were not considered to fit into the dominant culture, and were not granted the rights and benefits as though granted to white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. However, these various groups of immigrants were no longer socially, economically, or politically ostracized once they had survived the 4 stages in the development of group relations: competition, conflict, accommodation, and assimilation. Having survived these stages, they were not only accepted within the dominant culture, they acquired the full-blown status of being considered white. Now, although it might seem as though immigration to the United States from Africa shares the same characteristics as and can be superimposed upon immigration from Europe, the story is in fact radically different, because these 2 instances of immigration may seem to share characteristics, but are in fact not superimposable. If they were superimposable, one will conclude that after the Emancipation Proclamation, people of African descent would have been would have become fully integrated into American society, enjoying the same level and kinds of rights and benefits as other majority groups. Just as non-Protestant Southern and Eastern European immigrants were able to integrate themselves into the dominant culture after passing through the stages of assimilation, it would seem that the descendants of slaves in the United States should have also been accepted by and integrated themselves within the dominant culture once slavery had ended. However, the fact that people of African descent remain the victims of persistent structures of racial discrimination indicate that despite experiencing a similar history of domination and marginalization, it was not structurally possible for them to be integrated into white Anglo-Saxon Protestant culture, that is, to be considered white. Blacks, logically speaking, and by definition, can never become white. However, while European immigrants enjoyed the opportunity of being integrated into the dominant culture, the descendants of African immigrants, by virtue of their Blackness, are not given the opportunity to be considered as equals living among equals within American society. Thus, the condition of African immigration to an existence in America are not superimposable upon the conditions of European immigration to an existence in America. Here we have a case of difference and similarity, but a difference that cannot be accommodated within sameness. This is a difference that remains a non-domesticated difference because the two instances of immigration may share in many similar characteristics, but are not superimposable due to a fundamental structural difference between them. Although the term right and left have obviously different connotations in the context of handedness and political discourse, it is possible to briefly suggest how an intuitive categorizing can occur in the socio-cultural realm that is similar to the distinction between right-handed and left-handed anatomers. In this context, it is helpful not to treat all cases of group harm as being ontologically identical, namely as all being instances of a violation of individual rights, and as such, as admitting to no significant differences. What I suggest is that we frame a notion of social chirality by opposing a distinction between vertical forms of group harm and horizontal forms of group harm. Horizontal forms of group harm are those in which the harm group can readily appeal to establish legal and moral principle so that their complaints against injustice are intelligible within and can be accommodated within the political, moral, and legal discourses of mainstream society. On the other hand, vertical forms of group harm are hierarchical exclusions in which certain groups lack the ability to legitimately register complaints against injustice, since their protests cannot be rendered intelligible within mainstream political, moral, and legal discourses. These vertical forms of group harm or instances of injustice cannot be incorporated within the reigning political, moral, and legal discourses because such forms of injustices are not structurally superimposable upon the injustices that are horizontal. Thus, the kinds of political, moral, and legal categories of discourse that are equipped to address the vertical forms of group harm are themselves not superimposable within the political, moral, and legal discourses of mainstream society. Horizontal group harm and vertical group harm are political anatomers because they may share many similarities, but also display non-superimposability due to the chirality of the historical processes from which they originate. To ignore this crucial difference thus amount to a kind of silencing in which one's difference prevents one from being heard within the language of the mainstream institutions of decision makers. This amounts to a form of excluded difference, a difference that is outside the bounds of sense. Conclusion. This essay is an attempt to exploit the metaphorical, semantic, and ontological resources of the chemical concepts of chirality and anatomers to conceptualize a new way of understanding the notions of sameness and difference. This effort is important due mainly to the conflation of vertical and horizontal forms of harm and injustice as being identical to each other simply because they share the characteristics of being fundamental violations of individual rights, while ignoring that the historical origins of such violations give rise to a difference that makes these two forms of harm non-superimposable upon each other. They are indeed mirror images, but as such, they are political enantiomers, like chemical enantiomers that may display distinct physical and chemical properties. Vertical and horizontal forms of group harm give rise to distinct social and political manifestations and distinct existential experiences for the individual suffering such harms. Because the notions of plurality and the enantiomers recognize sameness and difference not as radical opposites, but as capable of complementary coexistence. These notions can serve as useful metaphors within social and political philosophy to address distinctions between the ways in which different groups experience and address oppression, domination, stigmatization, and other injustices. Thus, the common liberal view that political equality entails ontological sameness erases the differences that have emerged from the historical processes of racial oppression and domination. Liberalism encourages an unproductive style of thinking and the misleading image of a society as a realm in which all members are both equally perpetrators and victims. Rather than searching for congruent doubles, we must gain inspiration from chemical concepts and accept that within social and political discourse, seeming replicas are in fact incongruent mirror images that cannot be treated as equals. In a sense, the perpetrators are not the innocent victims. Thank you.
Okay, we have time for a few questions. So I think let's go one here, Jean-Pierre, then one in the Zoom. Okay. Let's first do Jean-Pierre.
Thank you very much, Clevis. It is a great pleasure for me to be able to hear you again after all those years. And as you know, the connection between chemistry and political philosophy, I have been teaching political philosophy for 1 year. It is a wonderful experience for a chemist. For example, from Jean-Jacques Rousseau, chemical metaphor for the social contract, to nowadays you and many others. So the notion of distinctiveness and differences is also used by Jean-Jacques Rousseau to explain why people are different in front of injustice. Okay, so what do you want to do with chemical metaphors in order to defend the value of inclusiveness now? Because it seems to me that the context dependence of chemicals could be a way to reconceptualize inclusiveness, to include people depending on different milieu in order to think about society differently. What do you think about that?
Instead of using chemical metaphors to advance the case of inclusivity, rather, I want to use chemical metaphors really to articulate the notion of difference, or to rethink the notion of sameness and difference. Because right now, at least in the paradigm of political liberalism, it is all sameness, and there's really no, I'll call it, no viable notion of difference. So for example, they mentioned it today, there's this notion of intersectionality. And everybody uses this notion, intersectionality, and they apply it to every single conceivable, I think, political case or political context. And I think that there's something sloppy about that. So again, things may be superficially the same, but they're not superimposable. And that's what I want to make the case that of these things maybe, again, you got the mirror image, but the mirror images don't mean that the things are superimposable. That's what I want to use the chemical concepts to I guess to illustrate. I think that when you try to use the, I think on my way of thinking, if you try to use, well, I think that in some sense, the notion of inclusivity is already dominant in the political context, and it is so dominant that it makes it then very, very difficult to concretely deal with issues. So very quickly, yeah, it's very quickly, and just a chemical context, it was like, well, not anymore, but once upon a time, at least in North America, every university talk about diversity. So then what happens is that you have this kind of hegemonic notion of diversity, where you take everything and you have a committee of 30 people, where everybody knows if you have a committee of 30 people, nothing is going to get done. So you can say, well, you know, yeah, we have these different groups. There's some similarities among these different groups, but yet we need to realize that there are these differences and that we need to handle the different needs and concerns of the various constituents or different communities of people who forms these different groups, instead of just putting it all together and like, when you don't get chemistry, I guess it's more like a kind of alchemy, like, you know, and you get something, you know.
Okay, thank you, Klaus. Is your turn now?
We can't hear
you. Are muted. You're muted.
You're muted. We can't hear you.
You are muted.
I can't
I'm
hear you.
sorry.
Oh.
Yeah, all those technique. It's good to see you and to hear you again, Clevis, after 4 or 5 years now.
Yeah.
I got a question. I have heard of logical atomism and of psychological atomism, but social atomism is quite strange. Sounds strange to me. Are there proponents in the moment?
Yes. Yes, and in political philosophy, the reigning political theory of philosophical liberalism is committed to an ontology of social atomism, in a sense of saying the basic units, or well, in terms of what are the basic ontological feature of political reality, and it's society is made up of individuals, and the notion of, or less political reality of a society or group is on rail. Society is just an aggregate of individuals. So political liberalism is committed to this kind of a social ontology of individualism. So that's how you get social atomism.
Okay, so then I have just one comment. If you are using social atomism in that form you presented, you should maybe turn to or change to molecular, so to say, a molecular form of that, because you were talking about enantiomerism, and this is just a sort of behavior we have only with molecules, not with atoms.
Okay.
So it should be a sort of molecularism, like.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Just one short comment.
Thank you, Klaus. Now,
Thank you.
Luciana, and finally, Farsad. Luciana, please.
Hi. Thank you very much.
Thank
It was
you.
very interesting, and I was thinking about many other ways in which we could discuss the difference between atoms and people and society. And I do realize the dialogue that you're trying to establish, like you just answered to Klaus, but I was thinking, what are the gains of doing this kind of metaphor, or if we could even think of it as some kind of analogy? Because although I totally agree with you on the problems of liberalism and the problems of how we are dealing with diversity, I think that we should instead of trying to articulate, maybe we should discuss the main differences between an atom and an individual. Like, for instance, the lack of history, and also in the liberalism ideology, as in the natural world. Like, without history, we can't understand why society is not just a group of people. And this is for me, an ontological difference between these two entities. So I was curious on what are the gains that are you?
Well, for example, as you just said, to the extent that traditional political philosophy, liberalism, exploits this notion of atomism and says the individual is like an atom. Well, then you can't pay attention to history. You talk about individuals as though they have no history. And when I think, and on my part, when I introduce this notion then of a conception of difference, exploiting some of these chemical notions, well, I'm talking about historical processes. History becomes important. So we're not using now atoms. We're not talking about society as a aggregate of atoms. We're looking at how the sort of historical processes, you must embed people within historical processes. And there, when you do that, then you see then, from that historical perspective, certain relevant differences, right? So for example, very quickly, this is a quick digression. I use the example of immigration from Europe and says immigration from Africa. But, and this is just a digression to illustrate this point. Social scientists in the United States, when they, and one particularly the sociologist, Donna Patrick Monahan, who was a member of the United States Senate, right, was a sociology professor. So the issue came up in 1960s. Well, if, say, European immigrants were able to integrate themselves into American society, but Blacks haven't been able to fully integrate themselves into American society. Well, there was no appreciation for the different historical contexts. The assumption was, well, maybe there's something wrong with Black people, right? So there was always this need to impose a pathology of Blacks, and still to say, well, let's look at the history. And what we see here there's some similarities, but yet there are these relevant historical differences or differences from these historical processes. This same kind of mistake repeats itself ad nauseum as it applies to other debates. We know, like, was it 2 weeks ago, the Supreme Court, in the affirmative action in the United States, it was the same thing, right? Where there was a certain kind of blindness to history. And the idea, well, okay, we're just going to treat everybody as individual atoms without any kind of history. And so that way, then, if you can't recognize and articulate the difference, or say why two cases that look very, very similar, we call them mirror images, but not superimposable. If you can't do that, then you're going to be able to meaningfully or substantively address a lot of serious political issues. So my way of thinking, I've been hanging out with philosophers of chemistry and chemists for like almost 10 years now. And I have learned a lot theoretically in terms of not being a dogmatic philosopher. I think if we philosophers, we know it all. So I find a lot of discussions and concepts within the philosophy of chemistry that are quite applicable to debates in political philosophy.
Okay, thank you. Farsad is waiting for a few minutes. Farsad, go ahead, please, with your question.
Hi, Clevis. Good to see
Hi.
you. You're only this big on my screen, but I know you well enough to enlarge you in my mind.
Good.
I enjoyed the paper very much, despite the fact that I was working very hard to jump from one set of metaphors to another set of metaphors, to a third and a fourth set of metaphors. So it required some acrobatic skill. I fell down a few times and got bruised. So I want to share my experience with you with a non-physical metaphor, like I was just using a minute ago. Actually, I'm just going to stop talking about metaphor for a minute and just talk about the pairs of oppositions that you brought in around the main issue of social injustice. So if that is a main issue, I think that that horizontal versus vertical concepts of injustice, very powerful and important, because it takes two things, and in connection with enantiomorphism, it's a good connection, I think, because two things that look alike on the surface, when you start to functionally put them together, they don't go together because they're not alike.
Right.
And once you recognize that, then you have to treat each one differently, because if you use the tools of one on the other, it's just a failure, because you're blind to that difference. I think that's a great and powerful metaphor. That's great. That is the horizontal and vertical thing is a great place to talk about enantiomorphism. It works instantly like that for me. But you did a lot more work in the paper. I think there's so much going on in there that, because I'm I have a chemical mind, as well as other people in the audience. I was, and for someone who doesn't have a chemical image in their mind, it's easier to do this. But anyway, I was thinking structural and spatial when you talked about enantiomers and the mirror image stuff. Whereas, and I got stuck in that spatial metaphor. Whereas, like this person before me, I think Lucienne was saying, the temporal dimension is much more interesting and important, as you affirmed with the history lesson. So every metaphor is appropriate and really helpful in some ways and not helpful in other ways. And drawing attention to the structural and spatial, not helpful. However, if you adjust the spatial and say this is a functional, thing, that might help. If you bring in the temporal dimension, that helps, because then it's easy. It's a shorter trip over to society, over to our historical situation here in North and South America. So that's basically my comment, that I think you have a really rich set of metaphors and a rich set of opposites, the temporal and the spatial, structural versus contextual, and all of that, and then horizontal and vertical, that working these in a way to kind of make it a shorter path from the chemical image to the social image. There's so many ways to go. It's really exciting, because this is like a many hours long sort of excavation into each of these. Anyway, any thoughts on that? Any reactions to that? I'd be happy to hear.
No, I'm very sympathetic to your comments, because I think you're right that there are some issues, I guess you could say, you could treat them within space. I mean, you could say it's like just situations that clearly involve situations of the violation of individual rights. And then I think when you're in a situation where you're dealing with group harm, I think that's where time becomes important. Because there isn't just simply an individual suffering harm in terms of a violation of his or her rights, but the question of a group of people. And for example, I think that Miranda Fricker and her notion of epistemic injustice it works well to capture this notion of group harm, right? Where a group can suffer a certain kind of epistemic harm, and it's not necessarily identical to the violation of individual rights.
Exactly. I mean, that's a great example of a contextual setting rather than a point, sort of one point intersecting another, or one point not intersecting, but one point colliding with another. And yeah, and with Klaus as well, I was thinking the enantiomer thing, that's molecular versus the social atomism. That's a great critique of social atomism, is to enrich it with that, with the complexity that molecules have, and so on. Very exciting. So looking forward to more.
See you next week.
Yeah. Okay. Oh, good.
See
Looking
you
forward.
next week.
Okay, good. So, Maribel, please.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed your talk. I think it's fascinating to think about social structures in these ways, and it made me think about, we often talk about dismantling oppressive structures, right? And if we think about that in sort of chemical terms, you can't just destroy a molecule, right? Aimlessly. Right, you in chemistry, you think about what structure do I want to build, and then take specific steps to do something, right? Rather than just aimlessly like hoping to get an ideal gas or something. So yeah, I was wondering how do you think chirality fits into that, and how it can help us rethink perhaps dismantling oppressive structures? I'm
not in the position to say how chirality will help with that. But what I absolutely agree with you, with your statement, what I absolutely agree with is your point, that I think that particularly in the context of progressive politics, again, there's this kind of nauseating deconstruct, let's dismantle, but nobody ever says, well, wait a minute, in order to deconstruct or to dismantle, something has to be there to deconstruct or dismantle. So there's really no talk about creating, assembling, creating models. So I think you're absolutely correct that's another problem that has to be addressed in terms of, you say, well, chemists don't fundamentally worry about destroy, they create things, right? So how can you create? And so that's something that I think that, I mean, it's a very important point. I've made that point, but I haven't thought about it within the context of chirality. I mean, maybe I know in the drug world, or makeup world, you have different substances, enantiomers left and right. Some of them, you can it's very good for the skin. Others aren't good for the skin, right? Is it telemedine? The case where one was good for, was it morning sickness? The other one was bad for the fetus. So maybe people need to think in terms of what structures would advance particular social values and which structures would advance particular social values.
Okay, so the last one, Jean-Pierre, I think.
Just a comment and a kind of sharing some things that it is a hard question in philosophy. From, for example, Deleuze philosophy. How can you define a repetition? How can you make a difference between a repetition on one end and a difference on the other? How can you make a difference between a situated knowledge, to talk with Donna Haraway, with a general knowledge? So the possibility to compare things. And if you want to compare things, you can refer to the ceteris paribus clauses, all things being equal. I can identify what a repetition is. I can do the difference with novelty, with the difference. So chemistry could be of help for you from another side, because as you know, I have published many papers about the meaning of the ceteris paribus clause. What does it mean to say all things being equal when things, bodies, substances are interpreted or practiced in relational approaches? So if you want to make the difference between a difference in identity and something which is common, please try to integrate in your reflection all the way ceteris paribus is reconceptualized from a relational approach based on chemistry could be of help for you.
Yeah.
Because it is, I think, more powerful than including metaphors in your discourse from an ontological or an epistemological standpoint. Thank you very much. It was a pleasure to hear you.
Well, no, I'm sympathetic with integrated anything because, as I said, I have gained, although I'm not a chemist, obviously I have gained much from debates in the philosophy of chemistry. And as I said, I think that if you just consume the philosophical diet, you get a lot of dogmatism. And I think, at least again, from my perspective, philosophy of chemistry has offered me a more diverse menu or dietary choices, so to speak. Yes, my philosophical appetite, my philosophical palate. All right.
Okay, thank you so much, Clevis. Thank you to all our audience in the remote places. So we wait for you tomorrow at 10 a.m. and we'll start with the lecture of Marabel Resmeyer. So see you tomorrow. Bye, Farsad. Ciao, Marina.
Ciao.
Guten Nacht, Klaus. Bye. Ciao. And the same for all of us here. Thank you for coming and see you tomorrow at 10 a.m. Okay.